So, today we are taking on one of the most stubborn, entrenched problems in modern medicine.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive issue.
Yeah, we're talking about the persistence of socioeconomic inequalities in health within high-income countries.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really build a rigorous conceptual framework around this. We want to know why these disparities exist, how they operate mechanistically, and how public health systems can actually structurally address them.
Because it's never just one simple fix.
Exactly. And to do this, we are grounding our discussion in a foundational text. It's chapter 2.3 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health by Johann P. Mackenbach.
The facts and the options.
Right. So our goal, as you navigate this text alongside us, is to really strengthen your clinical and public health reasoning. We want to map out the why and the how, because understanding the architecture of health inequality is really the only way to actually dismantle it.
And framing that architecture correctly is, well, it's crucial from the very beginning. The data we're going to look at tells a story that challenges a lot of basic assumptions we have about medical progress.
Oh, for sure.
Because we aren't just looking at a static snapshot of poverty, We're looking at dynamic systems that react to every single new clinical innovation we introduce.
Yeah, and to kind of visualize what that system looks like right now, I want to introduce a metaphor.
I love a good metaphor.
Right. So imagine a massive, multi-story department store. Inside, everyone is moving upward toward the top floor. And that top floor, in this case, represents a longer life expectancy.
Okay, I'm with you.
So modern medicine, better sanitation, economic growth, those are the engines driving everyone up. But here is the structural catch. Society is segmented onto different escalators based on socioeconomic status.
Ah, right.
If you're on the top escalator, you're in a high-speed express lane. It's smooth, it's fast, you just glide upward effortlessly. But if you're on the bottom escalator, it is a completely different ride.
It's bumpy.
Exactly. It's slow, it's jerky, and it frequently breaks down. It leaves you stranded or even sliding backward. So everyone in the store is living longer today than they were a century ago. But because those escalators are moving at completely different speeds, the gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom is actually widening.
That's a really striking visualization, and it perfectly captures the dual reality of public health in high-income nations right now.
Yeah, the engines are running.
They undeniably are. I mean, we've slashed infant mortality, we have treatments for diseases that used to be an absolute death sentence, but the distribution of that progress is inherently unequal.
Right.
And what Mackenbach's text forces us to confront is that this unequal distribution isn't some glitch in the system.
It's baked in.
Exactly. It's a feature of how social stratification interacts with human biology.
And the idea that social stratification directly dictates biological outcomes,
Yep.
I mean, that's something we accept as fundamental today.
Yeah.
But the text points out this had to be discovered historically.
Right. It wasn't always obvious.
No. It wasn't until the 19th century that public health pioneers could actually see the math of inequality. We literally had to invent the metrics before we could diagnose the societal disease.
And that historical context is just critical because before the 19th century, severe health disparities existed, obviously, but they were largely viewed as just, the natural order of things or divine providence.
So that's bad luck.
Right. It required the advent of national population statistics to actually shift that paradigm. The textbook highlights this guy, Louis-René Villermé.
Oh, in Paris.
Yeah. His work in Paris between 1817 and 1821 is a total watershed moment. Villermé wanted to analyze mortality rates across different Parisian districts, but he faced a major methodological hurdle.
Which was?
Well, modern economic indicators like GDP per capita or standardized income brackets, they just didn't exist back then.
Oh, wow. So how did he measure it?
So he had to find a proxy. And what he did was pretty brilliant for the era. He cross-referenced district mortality rates with the proportion of houses in each district where no tax was levied on the rents.
Wait, untaxed rentals?
Yeah. He essentially used tax exemptions on rental properties as an early 19th century marker for systemic poverty.
That's incredibly clever.
It was. And the correlation he uncovered was just undeniable. Neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of these untaxed low-income rentals systematically demonstrated much higher mortality rates than the wealthier districts.
It seems obvious now, but back then.
It was revolutionary. Villermé's conclusion was that life and death are not purely biological phenomena operating in a vacuum. They are deeply mechanically linked to social circumstances.
Wow.
And this empirical approach laid the groundwork for later giants like Rudolf Virchow in Germany. He observed typhus epidemics in impoverished regions and concluded that medicine is a social science and politics nothing but medicine at a larger scale.
Man, that Virchow quote always feels like a gut punch. Politics nothing but medicine at a larger scale.
It really reframes things, doesn't it?
It does. It frames public health legislation not as administrative bureaucracy, but as a population-level clinical intervention.
Exactly.
But fast forward to today, and our tools for measuring this phenomenon have obviously evolved significantly past counting rent taxes.
Just a bit, yeah.
The text spends considerable time detailing how epidemiologists quantify these gaps today. It focuses a lot on the tension between relative and absolute measures, specifically the relative index of inequality, the RII, and the slope index of inequality, the SII.
Right, the RII and the SII.
And in clinical research, we know that looking at just one or the other can completely obscure the truth of an intervention's efficacy. So how does Mackenbach frame their specific utility in mapping the gradient?
So Mackenbach emphasizes that simple rate ratios, like if you just compare the mortality of the richest 10% to the poorest 10%, those are insufficient.
Why is that?
Because they ignore the vast middle class entirely, and they fail to account for changes in the size of socioeconomic groups over time. This is where regression-based measures become absolutely essential.
Okay, so bring in the math.
Right. So the relative index of inequality, the RII, is a regression model that accounts for the entire population distribution. It calibrates the social position of each group relative to its size, and it ultimately provides a ratio.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, an RII of 2.0 implies that those at the theoretical very bottom of the hierarchy suffer a mortality rate twice as high as those at the very top.
Right, so it gives us the multiplier. But if we only look at the multiplier, we can fall into a dangerous statistical trap, right? Which is why the text insists we also use the slope index of inequality, the SII, to measure absolute differences.
Precisely. Let's imagine a scenario, say, a new national health policy causes overall mortality to drop significantly across all groups.
Okay, sounds good so far.
Right. In that scenario, the absolute gap, the actual number of excess deaths per 100,000 people, which is what the XII measures that absolute gap might shrink.
Okay.
A politician could look at that shrinking absolute gap and declare a massive victory for health equity. Like, look, fewer people are dying.
Right, I can see the press conference now.
Exactly. However, if the mortality rate for the wealthiest groups dropped proportionally much faster than the rate for the poorest groups, the relative gap, the RII, would actually increase.
Oh, wow. So the disease burden has lessened overall, but the inequality of the burden is actually worsened.
Exactly. You need both metrics to hold public health systems fully accountable.
And when we apply those metrics across modern populations, we see the true architecture of what we call the gradient.
Yes, there's a gradient.
Because the data makes it abundantly clear that health inequality is not a binary phenomenon. It's not just, the severely destitute suffering while literally everyone else thrives. It's a linear, stepwise progression.
It is the single most consistent finding in social epidemiology. With every single step down the educational, occupational, or income ladder, you see a measurable increase in morbidity and mortality.
So the earlier escalator metaphor is apt, but I guess we can also think of it as an inclined treadmill we are all running on.
I like that.
If you're middle class, you are in better health than the working class, but you are still experiencing systematically worse health outcomes than the upper class. The gradient affects virtually everyone.
It really does.
Which means we can't fix public health solely by creating, targeted rescue programs for just the people below the poverty line. If the entire treadmill is tilted, the entire treadmill needs adjusting.
And the clinical reality of that tilted treadmill is staggering when you actually look at the raw data.
Yeah, hit me with the numbers.
Mackenbach notes that in high-income countries, the life expectancy gap between the lowest and highest socioeconomic groups, so comparing manual laborers to professionals or primary school graduates to university graduates, that gap is typically 4 to 6 years for men.
Wow.
And it's 2 to 4 years for women.
Up to 6 years of total life expectancy, just erased by socioeconomic position.
Gone.
But the data gets even grimmer when we look at morbidity, right?
Yeah, it does, because when we shift from total life expectancy to healthy life expectancy, which is the number of years a person lives without severe chronic disability, that gap just explodes.
How big is the gap?
It's frequently over 10 years. Individuals in lower socioeconomic groups are not merely dying sooner. They are experiencing the onset of debilitating chronic diseases a full decade earlier.
A decade? That's incredible.
They are spending a significantly larger fraction of their shorter lives navigating chronic pain, mobility issues, and really complex medical regimens.
And what's particularly fascinating to me is how this dynamic plays out internationally.
The cross-national data is wild, yeah.
The text compares the mortality disparities across various European nations. And what stands out is that the highly educated populations across all these completely different countries have remarkably similar, very low mortality rates. A university graduate in a country with a weak health system has roughly the same mortality risk as a university graduate in a country with a strong health system. So the overall national disparity is almost entirely dictated by how the lower educated populations fare.
It suggests that higher education acts as this robust universal shield. Highly educated individuals possess the health literacy, the financial resources, and the systemic agency to optimize their outcomes regardless of their national environment.
So if the public system fails, they just navigate the private system.
Exactly. If local food environments are poor, they just import better options. They buy organic. The lower socioeconomic groups, conversely, are profoundly vulnerable to their macro environment.
Right.
If a nation has lax occupational safety laws, poor housing regulations, or a weak social safety net, the lower classes absorb the absolute entirety of that structural failure.
Which fundamentally reframes how we should look at national health statistics.
How so?
Well, if a country has terrible overall health outcomes, it's not because the entire country is failing. It's because that country's environment is highly toxic to its most vulnerable citizens.
Yes, exactly.
And this naturally pushes us to examine how this vulnerability actually manifests in the body. Like, if the gradient is the overarching structure, what does the epidemiology look like on the ground?
The actual diseases.
Right. The textbook moves into pattern recognition here, revealing what we might call the epidemiological flipper. The data shows that the diseases driving the gradient aren't biologically static.
Not at all. They are deeply sociologically driven. And to understand this, Mackenbach breaks down cause-specific mortality across Europe into 3 distinct geographical regimes.
Okay, let's go through them.
First is the Northwestern regime, which includes the UK and Nordic nations. Here, the gradient is heavily driven by large inequalities in cardiovascular disease for both sexes and massive inequalities in cancer, particularly for men.
Okay. Then you have the Southern regime, countries like Spain, Italy, and Portugal. Here, the pattern shifts entirely. The socioeconomic inequalities in cardiovascular disease are actually remarkably small.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, the gradient is still there, but it's primarily driven by cancer disparities among men, not heart disease.
And finally, you have the Eastern regime, places like Hungary, Poland, and the Baltic states. In this region, the data shows just catastrophic, sweeping inequalities across all major causes of death.
Yeah.
Cardiovascular disease, cancer, and uniquely massive gaps in external causes.
Like what?
Injuries, road traffic accidents, homicides, and suicides.
So if I'm a clinical researcher looking at this data, my immediate question is, why does a heart attack care if you live in London versus Madrid?
Right.
The underlying pathophysiology of atherosclerosis is identical. But the most revealing part of the textbook regarding this, and really I think this is one of the most paradigm-shifting concepts in epidemiology, is the historical evolution of ischemic heart disease, or IHD.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
The text points out that in Northern Europe during the 1950s and 1960s, IHD did not follow the standard gradient. It was actually higher in wealthy groups. It was colloquially known as the manager's disease.
Yeah, it was viewed as a disease of affluence. Think about it. In the mid-20th century, the risk factors for ischemic heart disease, a diet rich in animal fats, a sedentary white-collar lifestyle, and having the disposable income to smoke heavily, those were concentrated among the higher socioeconomic strata.
Oh, right.
The biological disease was the same, but the social behaviors driving it literally belonged to the rich.
But then we hit the 1970s, and the epidemiological flipper activates. As clinical medicine and public health evolved, we discovered hypertension treatments, right? We developed thrombolytic therapies, and we launched massive public awareness campaigns about the dangers of smoking and high cholesterol diet.
Yeah, anti-smoking push, yeah.
And the overall incidence of IHD began to plummet. And this is the kicker, it did not plummet equally.
Not at all. This is a textbook example of the diffusion of innovation theory.
The fusion of innovation.
Yeah. Whenever a novel health intervention is introduced, whether it's a new pharmaceutical, a diagnostic tool, or honestly just behavioral knowledge, it is inherently adopted first by those with the most resources.
Right.
The higher socioeconomic groups had the health literacy to understand the anti-smoking campaigns. They had the agency to change their diets, and they had the medical access to secure the new blood pressure medications.
Because they adopted these interventions rapidly, the disease burden completely inverted. By the 1980s and 90s, ischemic heart disease was no longer the manager's disease. It had become a primary killer of the lower socioeconomic classes.
The wealthy abandoned the behaviors, and the behaviors trickled down.
Which forces a really uncomfortable realization about medical progress. Whenever we invent a life-saving intervention, we inherently risk widening the health disparity if we do not intentionally engineer how that intervention is distributed.
It's a systemic side effect of medical innovation. It's wild to think about. The textbook explicitly notes that the rapid declines in mortality observed in the late 20th century were disproportionately driven by higher socioeconomic groups, basically monopolizing the benefits of cardiovascular advancements.
Leaving the lower groups behind.
Left behind in the old epidemiological regime.
And we see these dynamic behavioral shifts playing out right now with cancer gradients, specifically when we analyze the data through a gendered lens.
Yes, the gender difference is key here.
The text points out that for men, there is a massive socioeconomic gap in cancer mortality, and it's driven overwhelmingly by lung cancer and the long-term legacy of smoking. But for women, the inequalities in total cancer mortality are much smaller, and in some older cohorts in Southern Europe, the gradient is actually reversed. Yeah, higher socioeconomic status women historically exhibited higher cancer mortality rates. So why is that?
This reverse gradient for women is driven by two colliding sociological trends. First, breast cancer is the leading cause of cancer mortality among women, and it has historically maintained a reverse association with socioeconomic position.
How does that work biologically?
Well, higher educated women are more likely to pursue extended careers and delay childbearing. And delayed first pregnancy and nulliparity not having children, those are established biological risk factors for breast cancer.
Oh, wow. And what's the second trend?
The second trend is the timeline of the smoking epidemic among women. Yeah. Unlike men, where smoking was pretty ubiquitous across classes early on, the adoption of smoking by women in the mid-20th century was initially a symbol of modernism, liberation and affluence.
That was glamorous.
Exactly. The wealthy, highly educated women adopted the habit first. Consequently, they bore the initial brunt of the lung cancer epidemic.
But the textbook is quick to warn that this reversed or flattened gradient for women is highly transient. Like, the flipper is already in motion again.
Oh, absolutely. In younger birth cohorts across Western Europe, the behavioral diffusion is complete. Lower socioeconomic groups have taken up smoking, while higher socioeconomic women have quit.
Right.
Simultaneously, behaviors that mitigate breast cancer risk or improve survivability are being adopted unevenly. So we're watching the female cancer gradient actively shift in real time to mirror the deep inequalities seen in the male gradient.
If disease patterns are this fluid and they shift so reliably based on who has access to resources and information, it brings us to one of the central academic debates covered in the text. The grand dilemma of causation versus selection.
This is the big one.
In simple terms, does being poor make you sick, or does being sick make you poor?
And this is really the crux of how we design welfare systems. The causation framework posits that an individual's social position directly dictates their exposure to health risks, thereby determining their health.
Right. Poverty causes the illness.
Exactly. But the selection framework argues the inverse. It argues that an individual's baseline health status determines their social position via upward or downward social mobility.
So if you're chronically ill, your earning potential drops, and you slide down the socioeconomic ladder.
Yes. And historically, the selection argument has been weaponized by policymakers to justify inaction.
Of course it has.
The logic goes like this. If society is just a meritocratic sorting mechanism where the robust rise and the frail fall, then the system isn't structurally unfair. It's merely reflecting biological reality.
Wow.
Right. Therefore, public health shouldn't try to redesign society. It should just build a minimum safety net for those who fall.
The text critically examines this by breaking selection down into direct selection and indirect selection. So let's look at the data. How significant is direct selection where illness directly causes downward mobility in the actual real-world data?
According to the empirical research cited by Mackenbach, the effect of direct selection is relatively marginal when socioeconomic status is measured by education or occupational class.
Really? Marginal.
Yeah, and the reason is chronological. The vast majority of severe chronic illnesses like heart disease or cancer, they manifest in late middle age or beyond.
Right, okay.
By the time these diseases strike, an individual has long since completed their educational attainment. They've cemented their primary occupational trajectory. Developing angina at age 55 does not retroactively revoke your university degree or your decades of experience as an engineer.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. However, the textbook does highlight one specific socioeconomic metric that is extremely vulnerable to direct selection, and that's income and wealth.
Yes, the distinction there is vital. While illness might not erase your education, a health shock, a sudden severe medical event can absolutely decimate your wealth.
Especially depending on the country.
Exactly. This is particularly pronounced in systems like the United States, where health shocks trigger a dual financial crisis.
Yeah.
You have the immediate exorbitant costs of medical care, coupled with a sudden inability to supply labor and generate income.
It's a double whammy.
In these instances, poor health undeniably causes a rapid descent into poverty.
So direct selection plays a role in wealth depletion, but it doesn't fully explain the gradient across education or social class. That brings us to indirect selection. This is a much more nuanced argument.
Very much so.
It suggests that there are underlying personal attributes that dictate both your socioeconomic mobility and your health behaviors later in life.
Right. Indirect selection theories focus on latent variables like cognitive ability, baseline personality traits, coping styles, and a sense of personal control.
How does that play out?
The hypothesis is that an individual with high cognitive ability and strong executive function is more likely to excel academically, secure a prestigious job, and here's the key. They are also more likely to process complex health information, maintain a balanced diet, and adhere to medical advice.
So the underlying trait drives both the social success and the health success.
Exactly, creating the statistical illusion that the social success caused the health success.
And we can't ignore that the text touches on the third rail of public health sociology here, which is genetics.
Oh, yes.
If cognitive ability or personality traits are partially heritable, and those traits drive social mobility, does the gradient have a genetic foundation?
Mackenbach addresses this very cautiously, as the literature demands. He acknowledges the theoretical possibility that if genotypes influence traits like intelligence, and those traits sort people into social classes, then certain genotypes might concentrate in different strata.
Right, theoretically.
However, and this is a big thing, however, the text explicitly concludes that there is no robust empirical evidence showing meaningful differences between socioeconomic groups in the prevalence of genetic determinants for the diseases themselves.
Okay, that's crucial.
Any genetic influence operates indirectly via the traits that facilitate social mobility rather than some direct genetic predisposition to the illness.
It presents a massive methodological headache for epidemiologists, though.
A total nightmare, mathematically.
Right. If you are observing a population, how do you mathematically untangle causation from indirect selection? How do you prove that structural poverty itself is damaging the body, independent of an individual's cognitive baseline or personality? You can't just run a randomized controlled trial and assign 1,000 infants to grow up in poverty and 1,000 to grow up wealthy.
Ethically, you obviously cannot do that. So researchers must rely on natural experiments, real-world events that introduce an exogenous shock to a person's socioeconomic status that is completely decoupled from their personal traits.
And the textbook highlights two fascinating examples of these natural experiments that provide really powerful evidence for causation. The first is lotteries.
Because winning the lottery is an influx of massive wealth that has absolutely zero correlation with your work ethic, your intelligence, or your coping skills.
It is pure blind chance.
Exactly. When researchers track individuals who win substantial lottery prizes, they observe verifiable causal improvements in self-reported mental health and psychological well-being. The sudden removal of financial scarcity directly alleviates psychosocial distress.
Though I note, the text mentions the physical health outcomes of lottery winners are surprisingly mixed.
They are, and it highlights the complexity of health behaviors. Winning the lottery often correlates with an increase in leisure activities that carry health risks, such as increased social drinking or smoking in the short term.
More money, more partying.
Basically, yeah. So the physical benefits are muddied by behavioral shifts, but the mental health benefits are clear and causal. However, the second natural experiment the text discusses is far more definitive regarding mortality, and that is compulsory schooling laws.
This is a phenomenal piece of epidemiological detective work. Walk us through how researchers used historical education laws to prove causation.
Okay, so between 1915 and 1939, the United States was undergoing significant labor and educational reform. Over 30 different states altered their compulsory schooling laws, generally requiring children to remain in the educational system for an additional year before they could legally enter the workforce.
Okay.
Because these laws were implemented at the state level at different times, researchers could look back decades later and compare the mortality outcomes of the cohort of children born just before the law changed with the cohort born just after.
This is the perfect natural experiment. The kids in the second cohort weren't inherently smarter or more resilient. They were just legally forced to sit in a classroom for one more year. And what did the data show?
The data demonstrated that receiving exactly one additional year of compulsory education substantially and causally reduced mortality for that cohort later in life. They lived longer, healthier lives than the peers who missed the mandate by a few months.
Just 1 year.
1 year. And similar analyses in several European countries have replicated these exact findings.
We really have to pause and dig into the mechanism of that. How does sitting in a classroom at age 14 physically prevent a heart attack at age 60?
Right. It's not the math they're learning.
No, it's not just about learning algebra. It's about delaying entry into hazardous manual labor during critical developmental years. It's about accumulating a slightly higher degree of health literacy. It's about altering peer networks. The policy acts like a cheat code in a video game. It artificially boosts the player's resources, and suddenly their survival rate improves, completely independent of their baseline skill.
That is the ultimate takeaway. If indirect selection was the dominant force, if our health was predetermined by our baseline cognitive and genetic traits, then a sweeping legal mandate forcing everyone to stay in school wouldn't have moved the mortality needle at all.
Right, because their baseline traits wouldn't have changed.
Exactly. The fact that it did definitively proves causation. It proves that social position structurally determines health outcomes. And if social position determines health, then macroeconomic and social policies are, in fact, medical interventions.
Having established that causation is the primary driver, we move to the clinical core of the chapter, the toxic trio.
So how?
Exactly. We know poverty causes illness, but we need to map the exact biological and environmental pathways. The text utilizes a conceptual framework moving from risk to exposure to outcome, categorized into 3 specific domains. Let's start with the most intuitive one, material factors.
Material factors represent the literal physical toll of financial deprivation. Even within the high-income European nations Mackenbach focuses on, material disadvantage is stark.
It's not just a developing world issue.
Not at all. The text cites Eurostat data indicating that the poorest 20% of the EU population face massive income disparities, with roughly 16% of the total population at risk of poverty. This lack of capital directly restricts health-promoting purchases.
It's the inability to afford nutrient-dense fresh foods, resulting in a reliance on cheap, ultra-processed calories. It's the inability to afford gym memberships or preventative dental care.
And beyond consumption, it dictates environmental exposures.
Right.
Lower-income individuals are disproportionately sorted into hazardous occupational environments.
Right. Jobs involving exposure to toxic chemicals, high risk of physical injury, or just relentless ergonomic strain that breaks down joint cartilage over decades.
Furthermore, their housing conditions are compromised. They are more likely to live in damp, poorly ventilated homes that exacerbate respiratory illnesses. And these homes are situated in neighborhoods with higher concentrations of air pollution, industrial runoff, and chronic traffic noise.
And all of that elevates baseline cardiovascular risk.
Every day, yeah.
That's the physical environment. But domain number 2 is far more insidious, and it bridges the gap between sociology and neurology. Psychosocial factors. This is really the invisible weight of the gradient.
Psychosocial factors encompass the severe emotional and cognitive toll of occupying a low socioeconomic position. It's not merely the occurrence of acute negative life events, though obviously those in poverty do experience higher rates of financial crises, evictions, and loss. But it's the chronic, grinding nature of the daily environment. The text highlights a vital occupational health concept: effort-reward imbalance.
What does that mean exactly?
This occurs when an individual exerts massive physical or mental effort in their daily life or employment, but receives inadequate material compensation, job security, or social esteem in return.
And that's compounded by the demand control model, right?
Yeah.
You're working a job with punishing demands and strict quotas, but you have absolutely zero autonomy over how you execute the work, when you can take a break, or how you utilize your skills.
High demand coupled with low control is just a recipe for severe psychological distress. And individuals in lower socioeconomic strata frequently lack the robust social networks and institutional support systems that higher income individuals use to buffer against these exact stressors.
So you just have to absorb it all.
Right. They experience a persistent structural deficit in their sense of control over their own life trajectory.
Which brings us to the most controversial domain number 3, behavioral factors.
Yeah, this is where it gets heated.
Because this is the downstream manifestation of the first two domains. We're talking about smoking, binge drinking, poor dietary consumption, and physical inactivity.
The big four.
The text notes that in Northern Europe, the smoking gradient is massive, with lower educated groups smoking at vastly higher rates. And obesity demonstrates the clearest, most universal gradient among women across almost all high-income countries.
It's very pronounced in the data.
Now, I want to push back here because this is where public discourse often derails public health policy.
Yeah.
It is incredibly easy for society and honestly even for clinicians to look at a patient with a preventable lifestyle disease, point to their diet or their smoking habit and say, that is a choice.
Right. We warned you.
Yeah, we put warning labels on the cartons. We ran the public health campaigns. They know vegetables are better than fast food. At the end of the day, they are exercising poor personal agency. If we blame the gradient entirely on structural forces, aren't we just stripping individuals of their free will?
That is the defining tension in behavioral epidemiology. But framing these behaviors purely as autonomous choices ignores the neuroendocrinology of how the human body processes the first two domains, material and psychosocial deprivation.
Okay. Connect the sociology to the biology for us.
You have to. When an individual is subjected to chronic, inescapable stress, the constant threat of eviction, the high-demand, low-control job, the effort-reward imbalance, their body reacts by chronically activating the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis.
The HPA axis, this is allostatic load.
Huh.
The body's stress response system is permanently stuck in the on position.
Precisely. They are subjected to prolonged elevated levels of cortisol and catecholamines. This state of hyperarousal leads to increased blood pressure, systemic inflammation, and a suppressed immune response.
Which is bad enough on its own.
Right, but crucially, it also profoundly alters brain chemistry, specifically the dopaminergic reward pathways. When your endocrine system is constantly flooded with stress hormones, consuming high-fat, high-sugar comfort foods or inhaling nicotine provides rapid, potent pharmacological relief.
So the smoking or the binge eating isn't a failure of moral character. It is a highly effective, biologically ingrained coping mechanism for a nervous system that is basically under siege by its environment.
Exactly. The textbook argues forcefully that the systematic, predictable nature of these behavioral differences across social classes proves they are not merely matters of free choice. They are heavily determined by environmental conditions beyond the individual's control.
It makes total sense when you frame it chemically.
Right. If you place a human being in a high-stress environment with limited financial resources and surround them with heavily marketed, cheap, ultra-processed food and tobacco, their biology will reliably drive them toward those exact coping mechanisms. Demanding that they simply choose better without altering the stressful environment or the availability of the mechanisms is just clinically futile.
That connects beautifully to the macro theories Mackenbach introduces to synthesize these pathways. We can't just look at a patient's behavior at age 50. We have to look at the entire trajectory. This brings us to the life course perspective.
The life course perspective is a real paradigm shift. It forces us to stop viewing adult chronic illness as a sudden event and instead view it as the culmination of an accumulation of risk over an entire lifetime.
Because disadvantages do not occur in isolation.
No, they cluster and compound.
Yeah.
Let's trace it. If a child is born into a low-income household, they may experience suboptimal early childhood nutrition. This subtle nutritional deficit impacts neurodevelopment, which then subtly impairs educational attainment.
Right.
Lower educational attainment restricts them to high-stress, low-control employment. The occupational stress triggers behavioral coping mechanisms like smoking, which ultimately culminates in cardiovascular disease. It is a chain reaction of compounding vulnerabilities.
And the textbook also highlights the concept of critical periods within this life course, specifically referencing the fetal origins of adult disease hypothesis.
This is where the biology gets incredibly precise. The hypothesis, often associated with David Barker's research, suggests that environmental exposures during gestation, such as maternal malnutrition or high maternal cortisol levels, due to stress, literally program the fetus's metabolic and endocrine responses.
Oh, yep.
So a low birth weight infant may develop a metabolism optimized for a scarce nutritional environment. When that infant grows up in a modern environment with abundant, cheap calories, their pre-programmed metabolism aggressively stores fat.
Which massively predisposes them to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and coronary heart disease decades later.
Exactly. The structural inequality of the mother's environment becomes biologically embedded in the child before they take their first breath.
That is profound. The disadvantage is inherited not just socially, but metabolically. But even if we could magically erase early life disadvantages, we still have to contend with the most formidable theory in the text, the fundamental causes theory, developed by sociologists Bruce Link and Joe Phelan. For me, this is the master key to understanding why the gradient never disappears.
It's arguably the most important sociological framework in modern public health. Link and Phelan argue that the medical community is chronically distracted by proximal risk factors.
Like what?
We obsess over the smoking, the cholesterol, the specific pathogens, but they argue these are just the current manifestations of the gradient. The fundamental cause of health inequality is the social stratification itself.
Why is that?
Because higher socioeconomic status provides individuals with what they call flexible resources.
And flexible resources are exactly what they sound like. Money, knowledge, power, prestige, and beneficial social networks.
Correct. The core premise of the theory is that regardless of what the dominant disease of the era is, or what the current medical technology is, individuals with high socioeconomic status will always deploy their flexible resources to avoid the risk or minimize the consequences of the disease.
I think the best way to visualize the fundamental causes theory is as a grueling, multi-generational game of whack-a-mole.
Okay, let's play it out.
So in the 19th century, the deadliest mole popping up is infectious disease, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid. The wealthy use their flexible resources to avoid it. They move out of the crowded slums, they build private plumbing, they isolate.
Whack.
Exactly. Public health eventually catches up. We build modern sanitation, we invent antibiotics, and we whack the infectious disease mole for everyone else. But immediately, a new mole pops up. Ischemic heart disease.
Right.
The wealthy, as we discussed with the flipper, use their resources to get the new blood pressure drugs. They join health clubs. They stop smoking. They avoid the mole. We improve cardiac care universally and whack that mole. But then the obesity and type 2 diabetes mole pops up.
And the cycle continues.
The wealthy hire nutritionists. They buy organic produce. They access GLP-1 agonists. They have a universal shield. Meanwhile, the lower socioeconomic classes are playing whack-a-mole barehanded, always catching the brunt of whatever disease is currently dominating the environment.
As long as the flexible resources are unequally distributed, the health inequality will be perfectly reproduced over time, even as the specific diseases change.
That analogy just captures the exact mechanism.
It does. And the chilling implication for public health is that the relentless march of medical and technological advancement will inherently and permanently widen health disparities unless equity is explicitly engineered into the delivery of those advancements.
If you invent a miracle cure tomorrow and simply drop it into a free market healthcare system, you haven't solved inequality. You've merely given the wealthy a brand new flexible resource to extend their lead on the escalator.
Which brings us to a massive, glaring paradox that Mackenbach addresses head-on. If the fundamental cause is the unequal distribution of resources, then the highly developed, heavily socialist welfare states of Western Europe nations like Sweden, Norway, and Finland, they should have eradicated the gradient.
Right. They have massive social safety nets, universal health care, free higher education, and aggressive income redistribution.
Yet the textbook states that they still possess significant, stubborn health inequalities. In public health literature, this is known as the welfare state paradox.
So how is this mathematically possible?
It's frustrated epidemiologists and policymakers for decades. Mackenbach outlines three primary explanations for this paradox. First, we must acknowledge that even in the most robust social democracies, material inequalities are mitigated, but they aren't entirely erased. Income disparities, and particularly wealth disparities, still exist and exert an influence.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, there is a complex sorting effect. Because these Nordic nations have high rates of intergenerational social mobility and robust educational support, the system is highly meritocratic. Therefore, the individuals who do remain trapped in the lowest socioeconomic strata are increasingly homogeneous in their vulnerability.
Meaning, if the safety net is incredibly tight and the educational opportunities are truly equal, the people who still end up at the bottom are likely facing severe, compounding, intractable challenges. Perhaps severe psychiatric comorbidities, profound cognitive limitations, or deep social marginalization. The bottom becomes a concentration of the most vulnerable.
Yes, the composition of the lower class changes as the society becomes more mobile. But the third, and perhaps most impactful reason for the paradox, relates directly to the epidemiological flipper and the shift in how we die.
How so?
In modern welfare states, mortality is no longer driven by starvation, lack of basic shelter, or untreated infectious disease things a welfare check or a free hospital bed can easily fix. Today, mortality is driven by consumption behaviors, chronic smoking, excessive alcohol intake, and hypercaloric diets.
And this is the limitation of the state. A government can easily redistribute income through taxation. It can redistribute medical care by building a universal clinic. But a government cannot easily redistribute human behavior.
Exactly. You cannot legislate away the psychosocial stress that drives a marginalized individual to binge drink. Nor can you easily mandate dietary choices without draconian overreach. The welfare state provides the safety net, but it struggles to dismantle the psychosocial effort-reward imbalances that drive the behavioral coping mechanisms of the lower classes.
That is a deeply sobering reality check. It proves there is no utopian switch we can flip. This leads us into the final section of our deep dive, moving from the facts to the options.
The policy side.
Right. We know the gradient exists, we understand the biological and sociological mechanisms, and we recognize the fundamental causes. How do policymakers actually translate this overwhelming data into actionable interventions? The text begins this policy discussion by forcing us to define our terms, specifically the difference between inequalities and inequities.
In public health policy, language dictates action. An inequality is simply a neutral mathematical variation. A disparity exists. An inequity, however, contains a normative moral assessment. It declares that the variation is unjust.
So how do we decide what's unjust?
To operationalize this, Mackenbach utilizes a highly influential framework developed by Margaret Whitehead, and it rests on two criteria to classify an inequality as an inequity: avoidability and unfairness.
Avoidability and unfairness. Let's break those down.
The first criterion, avoidability, asks a structural question. Is this health gap caused by social conditions that can be altered by human intervention? If a disparity is purely the result of unavoidable biological aging, it may not meet this criteria.
Okay.
The second criterion, unfairness, asks an ethical question. Does this health gap result from conditions that are largely out of the affected individual's direct control?
So if a health disparity is caused by natural genetic variation in height, it's an inequality, but it's neither avoidable nor unfair, so it's not an inequity.
Exactly.
But if a disparity is caused by lower income populations being forced to live near a toxic industrial site, it is entirely avoidable through zoning laws, and it is entirely unfair because they lack the economic mobility to move. Therefore, it is a glaring inequity.
Correct. And when we apply Whitehead's criteria to the toxic trio we discussed earlier, especially once we understand how psychosocial stress biologically drives behavioral choices, it becomes clear that almost the entirety of the socioeconomic gradient in health qualifies as a systemic inequity. It is avoidable and it is unfair.
Whitehead also developed the action spectrum to map how different nations intellectually and politically process these inequities.
Yes, the action spectrum tracks the diffusion of political will. It begins at the pre-measurement stage countries, where there is virtually no data collection or research funding dedicated to the topic. The text notes Greece was historically in this position.
Okay, what's next?
The next stage is denial or indifference. The data might exist, but it contradicts the political ideology, so it's ignored. Spain was noted to have periods of this. Then nations move into a stage of concern, like France or Italy, where government reports are published, but tangible action is lacking. Finally, you progress to isolated initiatives, and at the absolute peak, comprehensive coordinated national policy.
But when a nation finally decides to act and design that comprehensive policy, they run into a massive evidence dilemma. This is something every clinical researcher has to grapple with.
RCTs versus plausibility.
Yeah. If you're a health minister about to spend billions of taxpayer dollars, you want proof the intervention works. In clinical medicine, The gold standard for proof is the randomized controlled trial, the RCT. But how do you run an RCT on a society?
You generally can't. You cannot randomly assign half a city to receive a higher minimum wage and the other half to remain in poverty to measure the cardiovascular outcomes. This creates a paralysis in policy.
How do we pass it?
Some researchers argue that insisting on RCT-level evidence for social policy is an absurd barrier to entry and that we must act on plausibility. They point to the origins of public health in the 19th century. When John Snow traced cholera to the Broad Street pump, he didn't run a multi-year randomized trial before removing the handle.
He just took it off.
Right. The sanitary reformers who built London's sewer systems acted on the plausible theory that separating human waste from drinking water would save lives. They acted on plausibility, and they enacted the greatest public health victories in history.
I hear that, and I agree with the urgency. But to push back on the side of the skeptics, building a sewer is a simple physical intervention with obvious mechanical logic. Social policy is incredibly complex. If we act purely on plausibility, we risk spending billions on interventions that might have counterintuitive adverse effects.
That's a fair point.
For example, a plausible intervention might be aggressively taxing fast food to reduce obesity in lower-income groups. But without rigorous data, we might just be implementing a regressive tax that further impoverishes those families without changing their behavior, thereby increasing their psychosocial stress and worsening their health.
That is exactly the danger of unchecked plausibility. Therefore, modern public health has to rely on sophisticated observational data, quasi-experimental designs, and natural experiments to bridge the gap. And using these methods, we have identified several successful, isolated policy interventions across Europe that directly address the mechanisms of the gradient.
The textbook outlines a few of these targeted successes. Let's talk about those.
Sure. In Sweden, the implementation of robust labor protection policies specifically designed for chronically ill and disabled workers successfully shielded those vulnerable groups from labor market exclusion and downward social mobility during economic recessions. It effectively neutralized direct selection.
Oh, that's smart. What else?
In France, the utilization of mandatory occupational health checks for all employees provided a critical, guaranteed touchpoint to reach manual laborers with preventative care, such as hypertension screening and targeted smoking cessation support, overcoming the barrier of healthcare access.
Bringing the clinic to the workplace.
Exactly. And in Finland, the universal provision of free, nutritionally balanced, low-fat school and workplace meals successfully narrowed the socioeconomic gap in the consumption of high-fat foods. By changing the default environment, they bypassed the need for individual behavioral choices.
Those are excellent examples of targeted downstream interventions.
Yeah.
But what happens when a government attempts the Holy Grail? A comprehensive, upstream, whole-of-society strategy. The textbook dedicates a significant amount of analysis to Britain's post-1997 strategy. This was an unprecedented political and financial commitment, right?
It was arguably the most ambitious attempt in modern history. Following the publication of the Acheson Report, the newly elected British Labour government declared tackling health inequality as a primary national objective. They launched a massive, coordinated, multi-billion-pound strategy spanning a decade.
How much are we talking?
We are talking about a budget that exceeded £20 billion. The strategy was truly comprehensive. It introduced a national minimum wage, significantly increased state pensions for the elderly, funded massive urban regeneration projects in deprived neighborhoods, and launched a flagship program called Sure Start, which provided extensive free early childhood education, childcare, and healthcare support for low-income families.
They attacked it from every angle of the life course. And crucially, they set highly publicized quantitative targets. They aimed to officially narrow the life expectancy and infant mortality gaps between the poorest and the general population by 10% by the year 2010.
That was the goal.
So with a £20 billion war chest and the full backing of the state, did they succeed?
The outcome was a profoundly mixed success, but regarding their primary quantitative targets, they failed. The strategy undeniably achieved important social victories. It significantly reduced the rates of child poverty, and it measurably improved the quality of social housing. But when the data was analyzed in 2010, the life expectancy gap between the highest and lowest socioeconomic classes had not narrowed. In fact, it had slightly widened.
How does a £20 billion, evidence-based, whole-of-government initiative miss the mortality mark?
Mack and Back's analysis is blunt and vital for future policymakers. First, while £20 billion is a massive sum, the interventions were simply not scaled massively enough to counteract the overwhelming macroeconomic forces driving inequality in the broader globalized economy.
It was a drop in the bucket.
Exactly. Second, the interventions were not perfectly targeted at the specific proximal mechanisms driving the mortality gap during that specific decade, namely the entrenched smoking habits and alcohol consumption patterns among the older, lower-income cohorts.
And there's a massive chronological mismatch here too, right?
Yeah.
Adult mortality is a lagging indicator.
It is.
If you implement Sure Start to provide great childcare for a toddler in 1999, that is going to massively improve their life course. But it does absolutely nothing to reverse the 50 years of accumulated cardiovascular risk in a 60-year-old manual laborer. You cannot undo a lifetime of the gradient in a 10-year policy window.
Precisely. The British experience proved that tinkering at the margins of the gradient is insufficient because the gradient affects everyone on that treadmill, population level, systemic changes, massive structural upstream engineering like sweeping income redistribution and universal basic services are mathematically required to permanently shift the curve.
It's all about the architecture.
If the escalator is fundamentally broken, attaching a slightly softer handrail for the people at the bottom will not fix the differential speed of the machine.
I have to ask the ultimate cynical question then. The textbook explicitly states that doing nothing is not an option, but it immediately details how the most ambitious, well-funded initiative in modern history missed its primary mortality targets.
I know, it's discouraging.
If you were a director of public health today, sitting in front of a Treasury Secretary, how do you pitch a new intervention? How do you say, I need billions of dollars, the RCT evidence is scarce, the last major attempt missed its targets, and even if my plan works perfectly, the mortality benefits won't be seen until you have been out of office for 30 years?
It is the single most difficult pitch in governance. The only way to succeed is to radically reframe the timeline and the metrics of success.
Also,
You do not promise a politician that an urban housing initiative will close the national life expectancy gap before their next re-election campaign. You promise them that removing black mold from public housing will measurably reduce pediatric asthma admissions to the emergency room within 18 months, instantly freeing up clinical capacity.
yeah, that makes sense.
You focus relentlessly on the immediate, tangible costs of inaction. The textbook provides the ammunition for this. Health inequalities account for a staggering 20% of the total costs of healthcare and 15% of all Social Security benefits in the EU, while dragging down labor productivity by 1.4% of GDP annually.
That's a huge economic drain.
You do not just sell a moral imperative, you sell the economic efficiency of upstream engineering. You have to convince the Treasury that paying to build the sewer today is infinitely cheaper than paying to run the cholera ward tomorrow.
That is a powerful, pragmatic reframing. We are nearing the end of our deep dive. We've covered the history, the metrics, the behavioral pathways, and the policy challenges. Before we wrap, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, building on the fundamental causes theory.
Oh, the whack-a-mole theory.
Exactly. We discussed how the wealthy will always use their flexible resources to monopolize the newest medical advancements. Now, think about the era of medicine we are entering right at this very moment. We're moving past public health campaigns about diet and smoking. We are entering the era of highly personalized genomic medicine.
It's a whole new world.
We are looking at CRISPR gene editing, AI-driven predictive diagnostic scans, and bespoke immunotherapies. These are the ultimate, hyper-expensive, hyper-complex, flexible resources.
Right.
If the fundamental causes theory holds true, is this new wave of biotech going to accelerate health inequalities at a velocity we have never seen before? If we do not fix the fundamental machinery of the escalator right now, tomorrow's medical breakthroughs might not just widen the gradient. They might shatter the escalator entirely, turning the gap into an unbridgeable biological chasm. Just a light, breezy thought to keep you up at night.
It is a critical, urgent warning for the next generation of clinicians and policymakers. As we move to close this session, we want to actively reinforce the core conceptual frameworks we have covered today. I am going to guide you through 6 rapid recall prompts based directly on Mackenbach's text.
Get ready to test your knowledge.
I will ask the question, pause briefly so you can actively recall the answer, and then provide the solution.
When measuring socioeconomic inequalities in health, which measure accounts for all socioeconomic groups and calibrates the social position of each group to its proportion in the total population to find absolute differences, flames. The answer is the slope index of inequality, or SII. Remember, the relative index of inequality, the RII, performs this function for relative differences, providing a ratio.
In the 1950s and 60s in Northern Europe, ischemic heart disease demonstrated what specific kind of socioeconomic gradient? The answer is a reverse gradient. It was higher in wealthy groups and was colloquially known as the manager's disease before behavioral diffusion caused it to flip in the 1970s.
Which theoretical framework argues that health inequalities persist across entirely different time periods and dominant diseases because high SES individuals possess flexible resources like money, knowledge, and power that allow them to consistently avoid whatever the current dominant disease risk is? The answer is the fundamental causes theory, developed by Link and Phelan.
According to the Margaret Whitehead framework, what two specific criteria must be met for a health inequality to be formally classified as a health inequity? The answer is the disparity must be considered both avoidable, meaning it is caused by changeable social conditions, and unfair, meaning it results from conditions largely out of the affected individual's direct control.
Which specific socioeconomic indicator is most sensitive to direct selection? The phenomenon where poor health directly causes a drop in socioeconomic status when compared to metrics like education or occupational class. The answer is income or wealth, because sudden health shocks rapidly deplete accumulated wealth and severely reduce an individual's ability to supply labor.
The persistence of substantial health inequalities in Nordic countries, despite their extensive social safety nets, free healthcare, and aggressive income redistribution, is commonly referred to in public health literature as what? The answer is the welfare state paradox.
Brilliant. We highly direct you to revisit Chapter 2.3 of the Oxford Textbook of Global Public Health by Johann P. Mackenbach to consolidate these concepts. The data is dense, but the story it tells is absolutely vital for anyone working in health systems.
It really is.
Because at the end of the day, the most effective public health systems understand a fundamental truth. You have to treat the underlying society, not just the individual patient sitting in the exam room. If the patient is running on a tilted treadmill or riding a broken escalator, no amount of advanced pharmaceuticals is going to get them to the top floor on time. You have to step back, look at the architecture, and fix the machine.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conceptual framework supports your clinical reasoning and helps you look at the world, your patients, and your policies through a more systemic, rigorous lens.
Until next time, keep questioning the gradient.